So it's really a very momentous occasion for us that Professor Anita Bose, who is, I think partly because she's a very understated person, it's very difficult for most people to know who she is. And there is one thing that cannot easily be hidden from the world, which is that she is actually the daughter of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose, who was, as people in the South Asia will know, one of India's foremost patriots. And in many ways, one of the founding fathers of modern India. And lest I get swayed by Netaji, I must mention that the reason why Professor Bose is understated is because she is understated, and it is very rarely that she talks about herself and her life. But I've had the good fortune of having had conversations with her, and few people know that she retired as a professor of economics at the University of Oxford at a time when there were very few women who actually could become professors in Germany. And she, I think, still is a member of the Social Democratic Party.
Yes, I still am.
And she served the city of Augsburg as a deputy mayor for some years. So
Augsburg, what's the neighboring city of Augsburg?
Okay, the neighboring city of Augsburg. So don't get carried away by the fact that she is the daughter of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose. She is herself a successful politician concerned about migrants and poverty and deprivation, and has held a prestigious chair at the German university. But I must not also understate the fact that she's not just an economist. She engages the life and work of Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose very frontally. In fact, she tells me that she hasn't written up a paper, but she has done some research on the presentation that she will make today. The presentation that she will make today is also very timely for us because, as you may very well know, the national elections were held and the results were announced just a week from now. And it was looking as if the India of Mohandas Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose would move in a different direction. And as you very well know by now, that it's not like India's democracy is perfect or that ethno-nationalism has been combated. But I have expressed this, and many of my friends have expressed it, that there is a breathing space for democracy in India. So Professor Bose comes to speak to us at a time when her father was certainly one of the most valiant fighters for the cause of independence and secularism. And India too has found a breathing space. So without further ado, then I leave the floor for Professor Bose to deliver.
I think I will start standing up when I get too tired. At my age, that does happen at times. Then I will sit down. Dear Professor Mukherjee, or in Indian vein, I should say Rahulji, or as an old Bengali, I would say Rahul Babu. And I asked my granddaughter, who is more modern than I am, how I should address the audience, because I realized that ladies and gentlemen would not be quite up to date anymore. So, dear everybody, dear listeners, welcome to this presentation. Thank you for the invitation. It is a great privilege to speak here at the Institute, which has been so closely associated, of course, not only with India, but also with India. And I'm I feel very gratified that so many of you have come to listen to a topic which is not really that up to date. But thank you for coming. As you know, the first part of the title of my paper is Subhas Chandra Bose, Bose's political agenda. Is it relevant for India today? And this question, of course, since I chose it as the topic for a talk, it won't surprise you very much if I say yes, it is. But of course, I would say yes, it is, and no, it is not. I think on the one hand, we have to look at the work of Subhas Chandra Bose in order to answer this question. But on the other hand, we also have to look at the context of his work and the context of our life today, the historical part of that. So the yes would be, there are some issues which remain the same in the political and the social field, whatever it is. And of course, there are some which do not. And let me start out with the fact that there are different aspects of Netaji's political activities that maybe we may look at and that may be relevant or not relevant. But after all, it's not self-evident that after such a long time, and it's almost 79 years that Netaji died, it's not self-evident that we would say that his work, his ideas would have any relevance for the specific problems that we face today. And of course, one of the aspects that he was concerned with, and that historically speaking was maybe the first political one, was local politics. He was, after all, when he was a young man, executive officer of the city of Kolkata, and he was also mayor of Kolkata for a short time. And of course, in that process, he could try to apply what he thought about real life and also what he had also learned partly, because one of the aspects that were relevant in his life, and I passed out a short outline of some of the major dates of his life. One of the aspects was that he passed the exams for the Indian Civil Service. That was it was in essence the training of an high-level administrative person. And of course, it was also a dream job for an Indian at the time. If you were accepted into the Indian Civil Service, you had it made. First of all, you earned quite a bit of money. It was prestigious and all that. And we are also talking about a time when India was not free, when India was the colony of another country. For an Indian, it was sort of one way to sort of be at an even level with one of the British rulers. And it was most surprising, both to the Indians and also to the British, that he passed the exam, was offered the job, and he passed it well enough to be offered a job, and then he declined that. But anyway, he had at least theoretically learned to be an administrator. And so when he became executive officer, he could put that to work. And in fact, he did. And gained experience. And he was, from what I hear, a very dedicated administrator, wanted to put into effect all sorts of policies. And even when he was put in jail, he continued to run his administration out of the prison cell, which today probably would be a bit difficult, but at least partly it was possible. You might say, well, was it the same then as it is now? Of course, some of the things don't change at least in the last 150 years, a city had to look to certain public utilities. And even though we have more public utilities, nobody could even dream of a quick internet and fiberglass cables or anything, but you needed to a degree water supply and sewage and waste removal and so on. And even though you need a lot more today, these aspects, you still had to do it. And he addressed himself to it, not only to meeting VIPs and giving receptions for them. The next level was as far as the level of the state is concerned, and also in his life, the next step was his work as an activist in the Congress Party, and especially when he became president of the Congress in 1938, there was a possibility to, first of all, make known some of his ideas and visions about what India would be all about. There was also an aspect of dealing with day-to-day questions, because there was a degree of political activity even by the colonials at that time. I'll come to that later. In any case, he had very specific ideas what kind of India he wanted to see after independence. And to just use a small label now, was his idea was that India should be a modern industrialized state. And that, of course, was one bone of contention with that great father of the nation. That was the title my father gave Gandhi. And Gandhi was not interested in industrialization. He wanted to see a more traditional, not only cultural environment, but also economic environment. But the then young leftist leaders in the Congress were interested in a modern state. At that time, some of you who have studied the history of that period in India, at that time there was a certain development in self-rule in India. That is, the British rulers passed an act, the Government of India Act in 1935, which allowed a degree of self-rule by elected bodies in India. That is, provincial parliaments, for example. Before that, even the cities had a certain degree of autonomy. Of course, if you looked at the content of what they could do, it was relatively limited. The really sort of important things were still controlled by the British rulers. And I'm an economist, so forgive me if I use an economic indicator of the importance. About 80% of the budgets were controlled by the British rulers, and only a small amount by the Indian provincial governments. But the interesting part was that after some deliberations, Congress decided to put up candidates for the legislatures, and then in case of winning an election for the cabinets of the provinces. And surprisingly enough, for the British, at least surprising, in 11 of the provinces, there were Congress-led governments that were put into place. And that, of course, all of a sudden also, even though the scope was limited, made Congress an active political agent even at that time. And of course, that also meant that the Congress leadership had to deal with some of the aspects these ministers or legislators were involved in. The third level, which, or the third phase, which showed Subhas Chandra Bose as a practical politician was when he fought for independence in the Far East, in Singapore, in Bangkok, in Burma. And when he, first of all, took over the command of the Indian National Army. It already existed when he came there. He did not found it, but he sort of revived it and built it up. And when he established a government in exile. And of course, this was a government in exile. It only had a very, very limited symbolic amount of square kilometers, maybe, that were Indian soil. That is the Andamans and the Nicobar Islands, and with their Indian name, which the provisional government gave it at that time, Shahid, the Andamans, and Swaraj, the Nicobars. And by the way, the still present government also sort of revived these names and officially renamed the Andamans and Nicobars Shahid and Swaraj again. And of course, here again, you had a limited scope of political activity because it was not a normal state with territory and all sorts of activities to take care of. But within that scope, I think even there you could see that Netaji took a number of important steps and tried to plant certain ideas for a future Indian state. One reason which we should maybe also try to imagine is why would a man like Netaji Subhas Chandra Bose be important today at all? I mean, I'm very happy to see that the number of the persons in the audience are seemingly Indian or of the wider Indian origin. I think there may be some Bangladeshis, maybe too. And how can we explain that after so many years, a person like him is still remembered? And not only remembered, oh yeah, that was a historical person like Churchill or Roosevelt or whoever, or Stalin if you want, or Hitler, but that he's, by many, he's remembered in a very emotional way. And that is rather unusual. But the funny thing is, if you look at some of the reports of people who were his contemporaries and who observed him, it seems that even then he was a very magnetic personality, and he impressed many people, simple and not so simple persons, in a very personal way. He created an enthusiasm and a dedication which was quite unusual. What still puzzles me how this carries on to today, because after all, those who live today, for the most part, have never seen him. There are a few over 90-year-olds who were in the Indian National Army who still remember him maybe personally, but most of them never saw him and only had stories maybe or even heard that. And there's a further aspect why this is rather surprising. For a long time, the Indian governments did not particularly encourage that memory. The story that was told is that India became independent because of the non-violence movement, and Netaji had no great impact. Of course, when we look at the documents which became available later on after some years of being classified, then we find that is not at all the case, that in fact it was not the military success of the Indian National Army because they were defeated, but it was the informational success that made this movement very important. You have to put yourself into the historical situation of the time. There were no modern information, there was no modern information technology. You had radio to a degree that was already a difficult thing, and Netaji used that, sending messages to India, both from Germany and from the Far East. You had no internet, you had no WhatsApp, you could not send photos, you could not immediately sort of post your success or defeat in the internet. In India, the activities of the Indian National Army were not really known very much. So after the Second World War, when some of the officers of the Indian National Army were put on trial in India, in the Red Fort, three, one Hindu, one Muslim, one Sikh. The Muslim was Shahnawaz Khan, Prem Sehgal the Hindu, and Dhillon the Sikh. They were sort of picked out as examples of disaffection to the British Raj, and they were put on trial as traitors. And when all of a sudden, in connection with these trials, the activities of the Indian National Army became known, that these soldiers had fought their way into Indian territory, but then ultimately, because of lack of resources and also the early monsoon, had to retreat. People became so enthusiastic again, because there had been a lull in the enthusiasm about the struggle for independence during those years, that all of a sudden, all sorts of activities evolved. And one of the important things for the later independence of India was the fact that you had a mutiny in the Navy and in the Army and so on, because all of a sudden it became known there were some Indians who had fought to free India and not to suppress India. So this also contributed to the aura and to the image of the leader of this movement. And for some reason, he stayed alive, and for that reason also some of his ideas do stay alive. And of course, of some you may not, or many of the Indians may not be aware of at all that they were his at the time. But this appeal to people certainly contributed to carry over these ideas. As far as my talking about this subject, I find it a bit difficult for two reasons. Being an academic myself, but in a totally different field, I do not really feel very competent to, in essence, talk here as a historian. And I'm also not an eyewitness. I'm not an eyewitness because I didn't really know my father. I was 4 weeks old when he saw me last, and first and last, and you may imagine that my memory is not very vivid of that meeting. My own field, as Professor Mukherjee mentioned, is economics. I'm actually a specialist in social policy and health economics and public health. And that's what I had been dealing with when I was still actively working at the university. And so I'm a bit out of my field. I'm sort of a lay person in this. So you have to forgive me for that. I passed out a few pages with some of the major dates of Netaji's life for those of you, most I imagine, who don't know. If you want to refer to something, we will not go through all of these things. But one thing we have to keep in mind, also in juxtaposition position to some of the other important leaders of the independence movement, Netaji was involved in the independence movement for relatively, or rather he was involved for many years, maybe not not that many years less than some of the others, but a very short part of his life. If you look at Gandhi, he was 78 when he died. When you look at Nehru, I think he was also in the high 70s somewhere when he died. Subhas Chandra Bose was 48 when he died. And so he was still a relatively young person. And if you look at his life, it had been dedicated to India's independence for most of the time. Even when he was a teenager, he was involved in that already. He became interested. There were different trends. One of the trends, of course, was a spiritual or religious one. He was a very devout Hindu, and he was in search of a guru and was really sort of interested in starting a spiritual life. But then also in the tradition of one of his main gurus, Vivekananda, he also looked at the more practical side of that, is the social situation of people, the educational situation and so on. And he realized that there were not enough people who needed help by others. So he was also interested in the social part. So not only did he take off on a pilgrimage to find a guru, but he also spent time tending the sick, the cholera sick, for example, and particularly those who were of lower caste background, who did not have access to much help otherwise. And eventually he got in touch with the independence movement, but that was also when he was still a teenager. And some of you may have heard of the so-called Oton incident. Professor Oton was a professor at Presidency College at the time. And we're talking about a colonial situation. This was a British professor who came there. I think he was a professor of history. And you had this bunch of young, partly revolutionary, partly radical students. Young people have to be radical. If they're not radical, then they're young. God knows what terrible grown-ups or old people they will be. So there were different problems between Professor Oton and the students. And the whole thing ended up with Professor Oton being beaten up by some students. Evidently, that was not a singular case at the time, but it became sort of known and important because Subhas Chandra Bose seemed to be involved in that somehow. I'm putting it in this ambiguous way because it was never so quite clear officially that he was. Actually, from what I heard from his uncle, who was a contemporary of his, he once told me, yeah, he was involved in it. And he himself also sort of only very ambiguously talked about it. So it seems that he also beat up the professor. But in any case, he was held responsible because he was one of the student speakers. And this also showed that sort of the self-respect of the Indians as Indians had become important for these young people. They did not want to be put down, and they maybe took exception to some disciplinary behavior on the part of their professors, which was not only British, but it had that aspect as well. So in any case, Professor Oton was beaten up, and Subhas Chandra Bose was held responsible for that incident and was thrown out of Presidency College and what they call rusticated. That is, he was not allowed to join any other part of Calcutta University at the time. And for about a year and a half, too, that held. And even though his family was reasonably well connected, his father was a successful lawyer and attorney. And his brother, Subhas Chandra Bose, by then was a well-known lawyer too. Even that did not help to get him back into university. But eventually, after 2 years, he got back into university. And so that was another aspect which brought him, as somebody put it, from being an interested revolutionary into a leadership role to some extent. The next step, I already mentioned it, resigning from the ICS had great symbolic value for Indians, and it shocked the British. Some of the people who had been rather unfriendly with him before sort of tried to coax him into accepting that posting, because it really was rather shameful for the British as well that somebody would turn down their sterling service as an opportunity. But he said, I can't serve two masters. And there were some aspects which really were truly also in the ICS, even though there were Indians who held these positions, where they really sort of treated Indians in a rather derogatory manner. Coming back after resigning from the ICS, when that happened, when he was still in England. And his first action was to go and see Mahatma Gandhi. And during that interview, I think also Mahatma Gandhi saw that this was one of the more radical youngsters who was looking for something to do in the interest of India's independence. So the Bengalis in general were rather radical at the time. That was a more radical part of the movement. And so one of the, or the leader in Bengal was C.R. Das, and Gandhi sent him to C.R. Das and thought this somewhat troublesome youngster was in better hands with C.R. Das. And as I mentioned before, during that period, you had the beginning of a degree of self-rule. And at the municipal level, that occurred already in the early 1920s. We're talking about the year 1921 now. And after some deliberation, there were some of the Congress members who ran for office in the municipality of positions of city councillors, you might call them here. And the Congress candidates did extremely well, and Congress gained control of the Kolkata Corporation. And in fact, C.R. Das decided to run for mayor, and he became the mayor of Calcutta. And he wanted Subhas to act as the executive officer. And of course, first he did not want to do that, and he felt very hesitant. First of all, he said, I resigned from the ICS and now should become an administrator. After all, a lot of even the local government was controlled by the British Raj. But C.R. Das persuaded him to do it, and he did so, but only when it was clear that he would donate 1/2 of his income to the poor. 21 was also the year when he had his first visit in jail. And that was the first of 11 times being put in jail during that period. And being put in jail at that time meant not a due process of law, but it meant you were put in jail and you did not have a trial very often. Unfortunately, in 1925, Sir Das passed away. And eventually, some years later, Subhas Chandra Bose also became mayor of Kolkata, but part of the time, in fact, he was elected while he was in jail again. And during all these times in jail, his health certainly did not improve. He was in very poor health throughout. I don't know whether he was in poor health to begin with, but in any case, after these stays in jail, particularly in the 1920s, he was in Mandalay in Burma, which evidently had a very unhealthy climate at the time. And he became quite sick. And again, during another time in jail, he was continuously ill, in essence. So in 1933, eventually the British decided to allow him to travel to Europe. They were not interested in setting him free in India. In fact, that was the condition, that he would not stay in India. He could go to Europe and get medical treatment there, of course, on his own, with his own money, or rather with his brother's money, because as one of my nephews once put it, Subhas Chandra Bose was Subhas Chandra Bose's pocketbook. My uncle Sharad was an exceedingly successful lawyer when he was out of jail and worked as a lawyer. He earned very well. He had a big family, and he was not only the political supporter of his brother, but also his financier. Subhas Chandra Bose got a contract to write a story of the Indian independence struggle. And he did that in Vienna, Austria mainly. And during that period, something important happened for me, at least. My father was looking for a secretary, and my mother at that time took an English language course with an Indian student. And when my father asked the student, "Don't you know some lady who would be working as a secretarial assistant for me?" He had two candidates, and actually my mother knew less English than the other lady, but my father somehow didn't like her and said, "Why don't you send the other lady for an interview?" And this is how my parents met. You have to imagine that not only my father, but also other freedom fighters at the time were forced to leave the country. I mean, some were in jail, quite a few of them, and some were left. Some went to Japan, Raj Bihari Bose, for example. Others went to other countries. And so my father was also exiled, in essence. And during that period when he was in Europe, he really used the time to start building up contacts with different countries and looked at developed the international aspect of the independence struggle. He met all sorts of people in different parts of Europe. Interestingly enough, he was not allowed to travel to England. But he could travel to some of the other countries on the European continent. And so during that period, he not only finished the book, The Indian Struggle, he did in fact go back to India for a short visit, because he got the news that his father was on his deathbed. And so the day when the manuscript was finished, he set out to return to India. And you have to imagine what taking a plane to go to India meant at the time. It took 4 days to travel by plane from Europe to India because airplanes were slow, they did not fly at night. So he flew from Vienna to Rome, to Cairo, to Baghdad, to Karachi, and then to Kolkata. And in Kolkata, he had a very warm welcome by the police. They arrested him immediately. But since his father had just passed away the day before, they allowed him to be home interned. And after a few weeks, they allowed him to go back to Europe again. But in any case, he was still battling with his ill health. And it had turned out already before that he had a gallbladder problem, that is a gallbladder stone. And today, if you have a gallbladder operation, you are out within 3, 4, 5, 6 days maybe. It's not a minor operation, but it's not a very big operation. At that time, you had a big cut in your tummy. It was very dangerous, and in fact, he was asked to make a testament. And so he made a quick testament. He said, "My love to my countrymen and my liabilities to my brother." But in any case, he survived the operation and continued working on all sorts of things, partly, well, not out of hospital, but after he was released from hospital and went to a short spa. He went to Karlsbad. Those of you who know where that is, Karlsbad is a famous spa, in fact, in what is now Czechia. And even today, it's also a famous spa. And especially if you have gallbladder trouble, they have waters which you drink, which supposedly helps for that. And he was also busy with other things. For example, later on in 1935, he had the operation, and then he partly recuperated during that year. In 1936, he had several important meetings, and one of them was he met Kamala Nehru, the wife of Jawaharlal Nehru, who had come to Europe for treatment. She had tuberculosis, and he met her in Vienna, accompanied her part of the way to Berlin, and then later on met Jawaharlal Nehru and took him to Baden-Weiler, where she was recuperating, and then even later he saw them in Lausanne, where Mrs. Nehru passed away, and helped with the arrangements for funeral or rather cremation and so on. At that time, the two then young Congress leaders, Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose, were rather close and friendly. They were also close and friendly because they had rather similar ideas, politically speaking. They were the leftist youngsters in the Congress leadership. And many of the other Congress leaders were more on the traditional Gandhian side, that is against modern developments and industrialization. And well, I think most of you are familiar, at least with the great outlines of the Gandhian politics of the day. In 1936, Subhas Chandra Bose decided he did not want to continue in exile. In fact, in a much later situation, he was once asked what he would consider the most terrible thing in his life, and he said to be put into exile. He decided to return to India, even though he was warned that he would not be allowed to be free in India. So again, when he set foot on Indian soil in Mumbai that time, he had a warm welcome by the police and was put into jail in Mumbai, then to Calcutta, and then eventually in Kurseong, which is close to Darjeeling, in his brother's vacation home. And he had to stay there for a long time, and partly it was evidently boring because he was not allowed to move very far. He could correspond, but of course all his correspondence was censored. It's quite interesting to see some of these letters with the stamp censored and passed. And in winter, the climate in Kaohsiung is not that pleasant. In summer, it is great. That Darjeeling and these hill stations are summer resorts. But in winter, he got quite ill. Evidently, there was one aspect he had was his gallbladder problem, but there was another one repeatedly. For some reason, he seemed to be getting some bronchopulmonary problems, and being in the hillside in winter was not very good for his health. And so he was relocated to a prison hospital in Kolkata. And then 1937 was released. He got active in all sorts of political projects at the time, as far as his health allowed, and then for a short stay returned to Europe. And at the end of that, that's what we're talking about, the end of 1937 now, 1938, he got the news that he was elected president of Congress, and he returned on the 20th of January 1938 as the Congress-elect for that year. You're probably, or some of you are probably familiar with the fact that he was elected Congress president 1 year. He was a very active Congress president. In fact, one of the institutions that he started during his presidency was a so-called National Planning Committee at the time. This continued into Free India as the Planning Commission, and the first head of the Planning Committee was Jawaharlal Nehru, whom he persuaded to take that position. And the idea was that this was sort of something like a council of not only economic advisors, but council of experts to sort of help develop some ideas at the time for how India's so-called reconstruction should be done. Because the idea was we have this colonial situation. When India becomes independent, we have to be able to start moving. And we need all sorts of things. We need ideas for how we want to do that. And we also possibly need people who are trained to do it. And the Planning Commission at that time was really involved in activities of making blueprints for that. I don't know whether there's still a Planning Commission now. Maybe.
2014 is not.
Or that just looks like the political trends left and right. Of course, the idea of planning is in essence more a socialist idea. You might say, okay, at the time that sounded like a good idea. You should really not just dabble along, you should know what you want to do. But if you look at the planning of many of the so-called communist states, the planning was not always very successful, and sometimes the plans were not really realized and all sorts of things. So maybe one can do away without it these days. But I think most countries, also the so-called Western countries, have activities of planning, even though they may not call them planning commissions. Then Netaji was, at that time he wasn't Netaji yet, when Subhas Chandra Bose was president of Congress. Some of the ideas that he had were in opposition to some of the ideas that some of the conservatives held. And these pertain partly to ideas of how India's politics should be, but it also pertained to how India should, or the Indian National Congress should deal with Britain. And one of the aspects that had been discussed at the time, in fact, for a number of years, was in what form, if at all, India should be independent or have at least more autonomy granted. And one idea was India could be given dominion status. And that also caused a big discussion within Congress. In fact, that was the first bone of contention, which was sort of more obvious between Gandhiji and Subhas Bose. Gandhiji originally said, yeah, okay, we can go along those lines. And the young radicals at the time, that we are talking about 1920, 1929, 1930, I said, no, 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 we want complete independence. And after some while, Gandhi came around, and Swaraj was, of course, what he agreed to later on. But between the conservatives and the younger firebrands, there was this discussion also going on about this dominion status and about the this Government of India Act of 1935, which I've talked about before. And these things caused tension within the Congress itself. So eventually, Subhas Chandra Bose, who envisaged a socialist state after independence, did not see eye to eye with some of the conservative Congress stalwarts. And he felt that they were not sufficiently consistent in trying to stand for India's independence. And therefore, he decided to run for president once again. And the right-wing Congress and Gandhi did not like that at all. In fact, Gandhi opposed it, and he supported another candidate. And the expectation was that the Gandhi candidate would win, but he didn't. And Subhas Chandra Bose won with a reasonably good margin. I think nowadays in many elections, people would be happy to have such margins. And so he became Congress president, much against the wish of the right wing of the Congress. And I think Gandhi was certainly a great man. He could also inspire people also culturally. But let's not forget, he was also a trained lawyer. And it's my opinion that he was a very clever man at the same time. And so he very cleverly pulled out the rug under Subhas Chandra Bose's feet. Not directly himself, but through some other people. In any case, the whole story ended with Subhas Chandra Bose resigning as Congress president because there was no solution of cooperation within Congress. And in 1939, where he had been elected in January for the second time, he eventually resigned in April, end of April. 1939 is a year where we had quite drastic developments on the international front. For example, in 1937, Japan in essence started the war with China. And in 1939, of course, Germany started the war with Poland, and that got Britain involved in the second, and that started the Second World War for all practical purposes. It became the World War when these two theaters of action, the Eastern Asian and the European, were joined when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941. So, but what happened in India at the time? So Netaji resigned from the Congress presidency and decided that it was necessary to organize the left-wing Congress people within Congress as a more formal bloc. And he formed the so-called forward bloc. during that period, of course, on the one hand, there was great enthusiasm and support for these more socialist ideas. But on the other hand, there was still the opposition from the more conservative side. And in the course of 1939, a disciplinary action against these left-wing people in Congress were taken. And for example, Subhas Chandra Bose was barred from office in Congress for 3 years. So in essence, he could not do very much within Congress. Of course, the left wing was still interested in all sorts of activities, and partly these concerned ideas about India later on, that is socialist versus conservative or traditional, whatever you would call it. But it also concerned the question of how do we deal with the British during that period. And the left wing was also the more radical in terms of opposition to the British rulers. But the background was also that in 1938-39, in Europe, the whole political situation had changed. Actually, since 1933, we are in Germany here. So, of course, for Germany, the important part was 1933, when the National Socialists came into power as elected party and then dismantled democracy. In 1933, for example, they got the parliament to decide, in essence, to pass the so-called Ermächtigungsgesetz, which was in fact a law which handed over control to the government. And we see certain parallels in many of the European countries, but also in India, that you have different steps of dismantling some of the functions. Maybe not through a Ermächtigungsgesetz, can also be that. That's the terrible thing that very often democracies use to destroy democracy. And because democracy tries to adhere to certain democratic rules, is unable to prevent them. You have any number of examples these days in different countries where things like that happen. For example, the discussion is in Germany, for example, should the constitution be changed in such a way to make the Supreme Court more independent? Das Bundesverfassungsgericht cannot be changed that easily if you have controls for that. Or in other countries, you have the way you deal with the press. Can you safeguard against such things? And in essence, some of these things were also discussed then, and slowly there was a move also to discuss whether how one should deal in India with a war in Europe. Because if Britain got involved in a war, say with Nazi Germany, what position would India take? And the left wing and Subhas Chandra Bose said we should take advantage of that. And when Britain is involved in a war, they are weakened, and we should make sure that we use this situation and fight for our independence. On the conservative side, including Gandhi, you had different attitudes. Gandhi, in a way, I would say, was vacillating over the time what to do. And of course, there were some who said outright, like Nehru, we are not collaborating in any way with fascists. We'd rather support Britain. And in fact, the perverse situation was that you had a fairly large part of the Congress leadership who were hesitant to take advantage of Britain, who felt this was not a very honorable thing to do, to exploit the weakness of Britain, but that one should sort of be more reticent in that. Some very clearly said, yeah, send the young people into the British Army for different reasons. For example, now, as I get old, my memory for names gets worse. The founding father, or one of the founding fathers of the RSS, said, he said, send the young people into the British army, but his idea was send them to get training. Others said, let us negotiate with Britain and we support them in their war if they give us either independence immediately or if they promise to give us independence after the end of the war. And that was a big discussion going on, and the left wing was more radical against that, and as a consequence, many of them ended up in jail once again, or some for the first time. And Subhas Chandra Bose again ended up in jail in 1940, and then decided, well, rotting in jail will not enable him to fight for India's independence. He decided he had to get out of the country. And eventually he forced the hand of the British by starting a hunger strike. Originally they said, let him die. But then on the other hand, they felt that was also not to their advantage. So they allowed him to be removed to his home and sort of be fed again and treated again with the idea of putting him back into jail. During that period, he prepared for an escape, and in disguise, he left his ancestral home at night. One of his nephews who had come every day by car to visit him, drove out of the building, and his uncle was disguised as a Muslim gentleman hiding in the car, and he drove him away to a railway station in Bihar and put him on the train there. He went to Kabul. On the way, he was in the train first, and he was very nervous whether he would not be recognized. And in fact, I thought maybe the Indians amongst you would like to see a memento which really did belong to Netaji. I brought you his pair of glasses, which he wore on the escape. These were his glasses when he was a student in Cambridge. He had very, very bad eyesight. In fact, that's why he was not accepted into military training. And so as a student, he had these glasses, and over time he got stronger glasses, but he couldn't see at all without glasses, he was blind. But using his glasses of the day, he would have been more recognizable. So he took his old glasses, which he had worn as a student, and for the escape. And his escape was to Kabul first. That was already not without dangers, because he, first of all, he was in disguise. Secondly, he was passing through an area. He was passing off as an Afghani, and he didn't know the language, of course. And as a Pathan, he was passing off, and so he pretended to be deaf-mute and going on a pilgrimage. And in part, he went on foot, by lorry. It was cold. That was winter in Afghanistan. It gets quite cold in winter. So they almost froze to death in that lorry. eventually they ended up in Kabul, and his idea was to get the help of the Soviet Union to support the Indian freedom struggle. But the Soviet embassy was unwilling to get in touch, and eventually the Italian embassy in Kabul was willing to help, first of all, with providing Italian papers for him to allow him to pass as an Italian. And the Soviet Union then allowed him to pass through the Soviet Union to get to Italy and Germany. In the end, it probably turned out well that the Soviet Union did not support him, because not very much later, the Soviet Union and Germany became enemies because Germany attacked the Soviet Union. You can already see one of the first very dangerous and romantic actions that he took. It sounds romantic, but it was also dangerous. It was really a very risky thing. Also in Kabul itself, for example, some policemen got suspicious of them, and then eventually he bribed the policeman with his watch to keep quiet. Then he was hidden in an Indian family's home there, but eventually he got away and got to Berlin, and then started his activities for India there. And the idea, actually, which he would have preferred, to set up an exile government for India, and to set up a military an army for India. And during the Second World War in 1941-42, it still looked as if the Axis powers would be successful. And successful meant there was one theater of war was in Northern Africa, and the Germans were quite successful for some time. And the other idea, which always had been there in Germany, evidently was to attack the Soviet Union and to sort of include Eastern Germany under Eastern Europe under German control. In fact, you may have heard about the Hitler-Stalin Pact of the 30s, and we know now that there was a secret addendum to this pact, which was not made known at the time, where the Soviet Union and Germany sort of divided up their spheres of interest. And graciously, the Germans left India as a sphere of interest to the Soviet Union. You have to realize this is a background for Netaji's trying to negotiate things in Germany. In different levels of government, even in an autocracy, you don't always have the same views by all people. Ultimately, Hitler had the say and could decide what things were, but the Foreign Office was quite sort of sympathetic to the Indian cause. And sympathetic meant not that they liked India so much only, they might have, I don't know, but they felt there was an advantage to Germany for by supporting India. And of course, the idea was Britain could be weakened if there was another front on which they had to battle. And if it had been possible to get German support into India to battle the British there, that would have been one way. Of course, it was already evident that Germany wanted to attack the Soviet Union. So for Hitler, this was no option, because the way via the Soviet Union would not be there. The Soviet Union would not be neutral towards Germany. So for a long time, there was a discussion going on about the so-called, what do we call it in German? Indian something or the other. The idea was it was a commitment by Germany to support India's independence. And Hitler was not willing to sign that. And even though the Foreign Office kept on sort of pushing, and yeah, let's change this statement and that statement, Italy was also not quite willing to sign it, at least not without the Germans signing it. So that made it impossible. And Netaji, on the other hand, was not willing to come out under his own name until this commitment by Germany was made. So he was still disguised as an Italian, Orlando Mazzotta, living there, but slowly got in touch with some of the Indians in Germany at the time. But in any case, Germany was willing, though not to sign this commitment for India's independence, to support India in setting up Indian Legion and to establish Zentrale Freies Indien, a center for India, which could be partly used for propaganda, for example, for making speeches and broadcasting them to India from Germany. I mentioned that before, that this was the utmost that you could do technologically at the time. Yeah, what happened later on? Or maybe some of you are, or most of you are political scientists, so you may ask yourself, what was the political, the legal form of this Indian Legion? The Indian soldiers in the Indian Legion, actually Indian or German soldiers in the Indian Legion, swore an oath to the Führer, to Adolf Hitler, and also to Subhas Chandra Bose. And you might say, why to Hitler? Now you have to realize there were foreign soldiers in the German army, but the Indian Legion had a different status. That is, there was a degree of independence. There was also a degree of commitment that the Indian Legion would only be fighting the British and not the Soviet Union. And other aspects. Somebody once asked, why on earth did they swear an oath to Adolf Hitler? To Adolf Hitler. Why not only to Netaji? Because the Indian National Army later on in Southeast Asia only swore an oath to the provisional government of India and to Netaji, and not to Tojo or the Japanese emperor. That had an important aspect. If an Indian soldier of the Indian Legion were to become a prisoner of war during that period, if he had only sworn an oath of allegiance to Subhas Chandra Bose, who held no office as a head of state or anything, they would not have been protected by the conventions protecting soldiers who became prisoners of war. You had to have a state behind that, and India had no government in exile at that time. Anyhow, the Legion was set up, and
we have about 15 minutes to go.
Hmm?
We have about 15 minutes to go.
Yeah.
So,
So-
I mean, your presentation is fascinating. I don't want to, because this
Yeah.
is like.
In any case, let me try to wind that up. The fortunes of war developed in such a way that any support from the German side was impossible or did not make much sense. But Germany was willing to support Subhas Chandra Bose's transfer to Southeast Asia, and there the War of Independence by the Indian National Army, which already had existed there for some time, was taken up, and the Japanese support was certainly far clearer and less ambiguous. And there again, it was this magnetic personality which played a role because Prime Minister Tojo of Japan made this commitment to India and made it clear that they would support the independence of India. There was a battle which brought the Indian National Army into Indian territory, into Manipur, but they were beaten and had to retreat. The retreat was pretty awful, but just to give you a glimpse of Netaji's personality, he was in the exile government at that time in Rangoon, and they had to get to Bangkok. And the Rani of Jhansi regiment, the women's regiment, some of the soldiers were there with him. And since they were not given the transport to go there by truck or train or anything, but had to retreat partly on foot, he went with them. He probably could have gotten the airlift or whatever by the Japanese, but he said, no, if my soldiers, also particularly if my women soldiers walk on foot, I do too. And so he walked part of the way there. Anyway, in 1945, on the 6th of August, Hiroshima was bombed with a nuclear bomb. A few days later, Nagasaki, and that ended the war. Netaji was on his way to Tokyo on a plane, and at that time you had these little hops of planes that planes stopped in Taipei, and on takeoff lost an engine and caught fire, and of the crew and the passengers, most of them either died immediately or shortly thereafter. 2 survived, and Netaji died that same night. There's a big mystery created by some about it. It's quite clear that he did die at the time. There were 11 investigations, 10 came to that conclusion, but many were classified for many years. And the last one came to a different conclusion, but if one looks at the details, it's very faulty. Netaji developed a number of political ideas throughout his life, and I think many of them are very general, like, for example, the principle of equality, that he not only asked for, but he also lived this principle of equality in the Indian National Army, in the government in exile. But on the other hand, it was not a true state, as I mentioned before, having all the responsibilities that a state has, but they had a Ministry of Finance, they had a Ministry of Women, they had a Ministry of Defense, Foreign Minister, and Chief of the Army, and the President, and they certainly realized this principle of equality, certainly in a very radical way, between castes, religions, creeds, between men and women. And Subhas Chandra Bose was uncompromising in this. I think this is one aspect we can sort of learn from for today. There has to be a respect for other religions in a secular state, particularly if you have many different cultural backgrounds, if you have different religious backgrounds, different castes, different creeds. And the other aspect is a commitment to equality in the economic sense. Maybe it was a bit naive what Netaji expected at the time. But I think in India, as well as in many other countries, we can certainly ask for more equality, and that's not outdated. And I hope India will go that way as far as it is possible. let us see what happens after the outcome of this last election. Thank you, and excuse me for being too long.
We have some time for questions, and I think we can collect some questions which Professor Bose can address collectively. And I think it is, yes.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for the
But everyone
lecture.
keep yourselves
Yeah.
brief so that we can have the benefit of the response.
Yeah, so my question is that I would like you to tell us about what were the main differences between your father and Mahatma Gandhi. Because if you see today in India, most people, they think Gandhi is a hero and is a legend. But I mean, Gandhi taught India ahimsa, which to some extent you can say that actually ahimsa made India weak, because Gandhi said he read Bhagavad Gita, then he was inspired to go on ahimsa. But if anyone reads the Bhagavad Gita doesn't actually talk about ahimsa, but it tells us to fight for against an unjust rule, and then it's your duty to fight. Likewise, if you look at the Hindu religion, when you go to any temple, you see all the gods and goddesses, they have some weapons in their hands, which means it's legitimate to use violence for legitimate cause, which your father did. And the other aspect in your lecture, which I wanted to emphasize on, is about the modern industry aspect, which was different with the ideas of Gandhi. Gandhi in Subhas, for example, he said that hospitals should be closed because if they give you the tablet for indigestion, then you will overeat. Then he said that the court should be closed because people with money will get good lawyers and they win their cases. So Gandhi wanted to take India backwards, but I think Nehru and your father were more similar than Mahatma Gandhi. So could you please elaborate a little bit on these points?
Hussain,
I just take.
just
notes
take the notes.
This is the third question. Can you talk about your life and your mother's life during 50s and 60s? I mean, the day that in India now we had a Congress in power, we have Nehru the Prime Minister, and we have the construction here in Germany. Can you tell us about the study, or your personal study here?
Okay, yes.
And thanks for the fascinating conversation. I just want to ask you, post-independence Indian political parties sometimes ask you for supportive statements for their favor or against other parties.
Yes, final question.
First of all, let me begin by thanking you for the great talk. If you're an economist, I would also like to pose you the question that in some aspects, you said that Nehru was very different from, let's say, Gandhi. His views of industrialization, his view of organizing the economy, and that made me question: how far was he on the spectrum? Let's say from Nehru, who also wanted a strong base of industrialization, also had a planned economy approach, and also wanted a lingua franca to be a mixture of all 2 or 3 different Indian languages and not just one language, which is Hindi. So maybe if you could just spend a very less time comparing and contrasting him and Nehru somewhat on the economic beliefs, obviously.
Maybe I should answer them now, otherwise I get everything, and then some of them, of course, tie in.
Yeah.
Let me start with the 2 last, well, actually, the last question, which also ties in with some aspects that you touched upon. Difference between Gandhi, Nehru, Bose, and other freedom fighters, I would like to add, is we have to keep in mind they were all working towards the same goal. And it's not really a question of it's either or, but any success has many fathers and mothers, and any failure does too. And usually to the failures, people do not want to admit to. But I don't know whether you were present in the online conference when one of the grandsons of Gandhi and I were in a discussion about, somebody asked us a similar question, and was the Rajgopal Gandhi, I think.
I think
He
Raj Mohan.
Huh?
Rajmohan Gandhi.
Yeah, Radwan. And he said, well, Anita and I, we are brothers and sisters. She's my younger sister, he's older than I'm. You see, our elders, so to say, were dedicated to this fight for independence. Partly they had different ideas how to do it, and there was certainly opposition between Gandhi and Bose more than between Gandhi and some of the other leaders, for the simple reason that the other leaders, including Nehru, ultimately could be persuaded to Gandhi's position, and he was a clever man to do that. I think my father was just as had a single mind track, and he had his idea what he felt was the correct way to go about this fight for independence, and he was not about to compromise that easily. On the other hand, if he was defeated in a discussion, he would have accepted. Gandhi didn't do that easily. He sort of was the more roundabout way to get even and get his own way, even if he was defeated. But you have to realize that particularly the then youngsters all were in awe of Mahatma Gandhi. So was my father. He was a great admirer of Gandhi, and it was he who had called him father of our nation and who had asked for his benediction, so to say, when he was in the fight for independence. Nehru, for the better and the worse, I'm convinced, was always somebody who sort of saw all sides. And you saw that particularly in what he did as a prime minister, and that was probably to a great advantage of India. He was one of the leaders of the non-aligned bloc. And he had also been, in a way, a non-aligned bloc in Congress. He was a leftist, he was in favor of the leftist policies, but he would not have been willing to go against Gandhi. And Gandhi could always sort of get him around if he wanted to. And I think that's why there was also a very special relationship between Gandhi and Nehru, and he wanted Nehru as his successor. On the other hand, as time progressed, I think Gandhi came to realize that even though Subhas Chandra Bose may have been a son who was not very obedient and not very willing to accept the father's views, but that he was a true patriot. And in fact, he later on really sort of was very appreciative of him. Even in the beginning, he said, after all, even after he had sort of defeated my father as a president of Congress, he said, he's not our enemy, he's a true patriot. So it was a difficult relationship between them, but I think Gandhi was the person, was a different generation, of course, and he was a person who was just not used to having people not obey him. And even though he may have sort of played a more democratic game, that was one important question. Now the ahimsa, the fight, you feel I didn't answer your question yet.
Well, the ahimsa aspect. Yeah.
I think
Obviously, your father was not in favor of ahimsa because he used legitimate.
you see, even the non-violence is not. I think it's misunderstood by Westerners very often. It is not a sort of goody-goody kind of attitude. It is a very convinced, strong attitude. In a situation where you have no weapons, you find your weapons, and Gandhi could do that very well. Even some of the things that seem to be very very peaceful, so to say. It was not at all very peaceful. I think it was an exceedingly clever way of fighting sometimes a mean battle. Look at the Salt March or anything. Many of the things that, so it's a question what weapons you use. And I think his choice of weapon was very clever and under the circumstances, great. And look at what Gandhi means today, not only to Indians, but Gandhi is a idea in many parts of the world. And many of the movements that seemingly use his methods, I think some do, but some don't. But he left this idea to the world that you can also fight without a sword or without a gun. And so, my father, on the other hand, was not opposed to non-violence, but he felt that this was not the only form of fight that you have to carry out, that you have to use all the means that are available. And even though in India, the non-violent form of opposition was the only possible and the only widespread possible, but in addition to that, you sort of had to come in, if need be, with foreign help and fight with weapons if there is a war ongoing anyway. So this is, I don't know whether I quite get at what you really meant. I'm not sure I quite understood. My personal thing, I think that probably goes too far now. We're wasting time on that. In just one aspect, maybe. I think even though when I was a teenager, after my first visit to India, I had planned to go to India. It so happened that I came to know my husband there, and he was Austrian. And he was an Austrian who wanted to go and work in the European Union at the time. Austria wasn't a member then. And he felt he had worked in India for 4 years as a social worker, and he felt that was enough. And for the time being, he would finish his studies and then work in the European Union, and then maybe from there work in India again. So I ended up not going to India, at least only as a visitor. And ultimately, I think for myself, it was the better choice because I could be myself. I could get away from the idea of having this reflected glory. I do appreciate it very much that people even now are that devoted to my father, because I think it's a thank you for what he has sacrificed. But on the other hand, for me personally, it was better that even though I might have been formally more successful if I had gone to India, but for me personally, I think it was an easier and probably less dangerous life. Also, look at the dynasty. Indira Gandhi got killed by her bodyguards. Rajiv Gandhi was killed during a election campaign. He was given a not too salubrious bouquet. His brother, we don't know. This is not an easy life, and I remember meeting Sonia Gandhi in a long time ago. That was just, I think, after her husband was prime minister, and she was rather critical of the situation, for example, also for the children. This is not a very easy life to lead. It has a lot of seeming glory, but I think in many ways we see today that very often politicians put in a lot of effort, ultimately, not only exploit situations, but they lead a dangerous life as well. And on a more personal level, it is can you be yourself? And I could be myself more living outside India than in India. I don't know whether this,
I think there's one last question. Professor Harder had a question. I think we can end.
We are out of time, so if we really have time for a question, just a short one, which perhaps doesn't do much justice to your very fascinating presentation. Thanks a lot for that. What I wanted to ask as a footnote, so to say, is that in certain quarters, even today, we get to hear, or much is made of this connection between Hitler and Brigadier, right? While the outcome of those meetings was pretty mediocre or miserable, even not much
At
came
best.
of it, right? So my question would be, why didn't Netaji's charisma work on Hitler at all? Apparently? What went wrong?
it's an interesting question.
Charisma was invented.
Maybe Hitler was resistant to the charisma. I mean, with all negative aspects of that man, he seems to have had a lot of charisma too. I mean, charisma in the sense of dazzling people, I mean, today, if we listen to some of these old speeches, we think, what is this funny yelling and screaming? But at the time, I know that there were many people who, you must have heard it from some of your elders, I did, who really were quite fascinated by that man. Why? I don't understand. But maybe that also made him resistant to Bose's charisma. I think my father didn't talk all that much about his meeting with Hitler, but some of the quotes where this man is totally mad. And of course, I don't know whether it was a disappointment by the time this meeting happened, because evidently Hitler had sort of not been willing to meet him before that. Maybe he learned from that and prepared better in Japan before he met Tojo, because he talked to many people before that. Or Hitler was just so set in his racist craze that anything, I mean, Indians were subhuman, and they were not equal in many ways. I mean, could give you examples. The marriage between Indians and Germans were not permitted. One of the last things that my father managed before he went to the submarine, went on a submarine journey, was he helped 2 Indians get the permission for the marriage to German women who had been bawled out for wanting to waste the valuable German blood on foreigners. And one of the ladies was quarter Jewish and said, I was not aware that I'm so valuable. So it is puzzling, but I think ultimately Germany at that stage also didn't have that much to offer to India. Whereas Japan, yeah, even for Japan it was difficult, and the support was surprising, let's put it that way.
So thank you very much, Professor Bose. I think need this lecture any shorter, because your insights are much more than what we can read in the books. And you were certainly professorial. You should not run away, because I mean, nowadays, professors don't talk for more than let's say an hour and 15 minutes. So
no, I have the theory that all teaching personnel, teachers in schools, and after all, professors are also teachers, talk too long and talk too much. And it's obvious. I incited my husband, who is also was a professor as well, and I once said on my 80th birthday, I said, only I'm going to talk, nobody else. And then he said, "No, I also want to talk." And I said, "Okay, you are also a teacher, so you may also talk." So excuse me for being too long. It is, I think, the consequence of a long habit of being a professor.
No, but you see, you are a professor in Heidelberg University now, so this is where we welcome such talkers.
Yeah, but unfortunately, I gave too little time to the.
No, but what you said was so valuable that I didn't want to apprise you at the time. Because the flow was something we didn't want to break.
Thank
And
you.
then you have addressed all the questions, so. Thank you. It is really a privilege and we are indeed very, very lucky that you could make the time and visit us. We have, this is.